So a lot going on here in Hosea. If you kind of remember back when we started, the beginning of Hosea is a pretty shocking thing. God says to Hosea, "Go and marry a prostitute, because the people of Israel have committed adultery against me." Now God does this because he is using Hosea's life and marriage as a metaphor for his relationship to Israel. The people had made a covenant with God and had broken that covenant by worshiping other gods, much like a cheating spouse. Now, with that metaphor established in kind of the first 3 chapters of Hosea, we move to the kind of the middle section of the book, where we kind of get multiple and deeper explanations of kind of what these sins look like and what the judgment is that is coming due because of this spiritual adultery. And that's kind of what we have here in this passage. God is explaining the sins of the people. He's trying to make them see the evil of their actions. He's trying to wake them up to their sins. And he does that through a series of illustrations about the people. God, through Hosea, was describing the ways Israel had rejected God through these pictures. But we here today have a part in this as well. Now, I want to make it very clear in this passage is addressed to Israel at a very specific period in history. This is a historical text. And we are not Israel. And this is not addressed specifically to us, but there are universal principles here that are quite relevant for us today. There are truths about who God is, about what it looks like to reject God. And so we can't just see the ways that Israel rejects God here. We must also see the ways we too reject God here. So let's talk about how this passage is organized, because there's a lot going on. And while there are a few different ways we could organize this kind of passage and think about it, I think one of the most helpful is going to be breaking it down by 5 pictures or illustrations that describe the ways we reject God. The first picture we can see in chapter 6, verses 4 through 6, and it is, "We reject God like a morning mist." And the second picture, "We reject God like robbers," and that's in chapter 6, verse 7 through chapter 7, verse 2. And the third picture, "We reject God like a blazing oven," and that's chapter 7, verse 3 through verse 7. And the fourth picture, "We reject God like a senseless dove," chapter 7, verse 8 through 12. And the fifth picture, "We reject God like a treacherous bow," chapter 7, verse 13 through 16. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, a 5-point sermon, right? We're going to be here a while. But have no fear, I will get you out. We will make lunch, I promise. In order to do that, let's go ahead and dive in. First picture, like a morning mist. Chapter 6, verses 4 through 6, it says this: "What shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. Therefore I have hewn them with the prophets, I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as the light. For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." Now at the beginning here, it seems that God is at his wits' end with the people. "What shall I do with you?" he says. It is like he's fed up with them, like a parent dealing with a strong-willed and misbehaving child. The parents have tried every form of discipline they can think of, right? Whether it's timeouts or spanking or taking things away or trying to instill a very deep sense of empathy. This is what my grandma did to me. How would you feel if you did that? Someone did that to you? That kind of deep inset guilt that I still have to this day. But they're trying everything, right? And yet this child is still strong-willed and misbehaving. Yet the child just stares them down while it throws food on the floor. And so the parent says, "What shall I do with you?" And that is where the Lord finds himself with the people, frustrated. If we look back at the previous verses of chapter 6, we can see that there was a call from Hosea for the people to turn back. Let us return to the Lord, Hosea says. Well, it seems like there was no response from the people to Hosea's call. And so the Lord is exasperated with them. Now we know from previously in the book of Hosea that he served as a prophet for about 50 years of time, which is a good long time to be a prophet. And along with that, it seems that the prophecies in Hosea were not all given at the same time, but at various points in his life, and then were collected into one book, which makes some sense. Scholars, though, argue about where these divisions are, because it's not always clear. But I think it is fair to say that we can see some space between this section and the previous sections. In chapter 5, we saw a prediction of war for Israel. But here in this section, it seems as if the war has come. In verse 5, it says, "Therefore, I have hewn them by the prophets, I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as the light." It seems the Lord has already brought some judgment to them. First, by the declaration of punishment to them from the prophets, like Hosea, and then by the bringing of death and war at his command, as he says, through the word of his mouth. Now, scholars believe that this passage, this kind of war, is more than likely referring to what they call the Syro-Ephraimite War. Syro-Ephraimite War, where Israel and Syria try to team up against the big dogs, the Assyrians. Now, you might imagine this does not go well for them. Much of the territory of Israel is conquered in this war, and many of its people are deported. And only the territory of the tribe of Ephraim remains independent, which may be another reason for the extensive use of the name Ephraim in these chapters. Now, I bring all this up because it does help us kind of give context and historical background to this time period. But I also think it helps us understand the Lord's words here. He has already brought judgment and war and death to the people because of their sins. And yet, they still do not repent. And so that brings us to the first picture in our passage. It says in the second half of verse 4, "Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away." The love of Israel is like the morning fog at the beach or the early dew on a spring morning. And what happens to the mist and the dew? It burns away. It doesn't last. As soon as the sun comes up, they evaporate away like they were never there. It doesn't water the earth like a good rain should. It just looks like it's wet, but doesn't actually grow anything or help anything. It is fleeting. It is temporary. It is empty. And that is the love of Israel. It's a love that looks like it is there, but it really isn't. It's a love that looks like it will do something or mean something, but it doesn't. It is hypocrisy. And that is not what God desires. It says in verse 6, "For I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." He doesn't want the show and the ritual and the pomp and circumstance. He wants the people's hearts. And this concept is really important in Hosea and really the rest of the scripture. Many of the prophets echo this idea. In Isaiah chapter 1, starting in verse 11, Isaiah chapter 1, starting in verse 11, it says, "What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and of fatted, well-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required of you this trampling of my courts? Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity and solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood." The very thing that was supposed to clean the people of their sins is bringing about their destruction. The sacrifices do not clean their hands. They are simply just covered in blood. And so, what's the principle for us here? The people reject God through their fleeting and hypocritical love. In Matthew 9, beginning in verse 9, Jesus quotes this verse in Hosea. It says this: "As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and said to him, 'Follow me.' And he arose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?' But when he heard it, he said, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners.'" Jesus is saying that the self-righteous Pharisees and the people in Hosea's time, who he was speaking to, are one in the same. That hypocrisy and self-righteousness prevents people from knowing and loving God. And I think it's easy for us to see all hypocrisy in our world today. Legalism, hypocrisy are standard in many churches. I'm sure some of you have encountered that before. But I think we can also relate to that in our own hearts. We can't expect to be made clean by enforcing some arbitrary rituals and commitments. Jesus doesn't simply want you to go through the motions, to just attend church and be unfazed. He wants your heart. No one wants a spouse who expertly performs the agreed upon service but doesn't love you. A wife who always has dinner ready exactly at 6 p.m. but does it with bitterness and resentment is no wife at all. A husband with that perfectly maintains the house and yard but never shares his thoughts or his heart is no husband at all. A Christian who comes to church every week religiously, you could say, and is never changed is no Christian at all. They are a morning mist that burns away. But the answer is not for the wife to stop making dinner until she feels like it, or the husband to let things fall apart, or for the Christian to stop attending church. The answer is to not just quit. Or on the other hand, the answer is not to just try harder. The answer is to rediscover the delight found in the Lord. I think we're all guilty of fleeting love in a way, of rejecting God through our hypocrisy. And what we need to do is encounter the love of God anew. Come back to him. Return to him. Rediscover the delight found in the Lord. And be changed. Second picture. Like robbers, beginning in verse 7, it says, "But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. There they dealt faithlessly with me. Gilead is a city of evildoers, tracked with blood. As robbers lie in wait for a man, so the priests band together. They murder on the way to Shechem. They commit villainy." Great word, villainy. "In the house of Israel, I have seen a horrible thing. Ephraim's whoredom is there. Israel is defiled. For you also, O Judah, a harvest is appointed. When I restore the fortunes of my people, when I would heal Israel, the iniquity of Ephraim is revealed, and the evil deeds of Samaria, for they deal falsely. The thief breaks in, the bandits raid outside, but they do not consider that I remember all their evil. Now their deeds surround them. They are before my face." Here we see the next rejection of God. The next spiritual adultery is not just hypocrisy, but also deceit, theft, violence, and murder. The text says, like Adam, they transgressed. There is a universality to these condemnations, to the problem here. This is not a new thing. This is not a problem for Israel alone. It is something that is characteristic to all the sons of Adam, all people. We are faithless with God. And what comes of this faithlessness, but sin and corruption and violence, we see in the next verses. The mentioning of Gilead in verse 5 is probably a reference to the 50 men of Gilead who helped Pekah assassinate King Pekahiah. And this is all in kind of 2 Kings chapter 15. And this kind of thing was very popular at this time. It was happening over and over, where one person would assassinate the king and then in turn be assassinated himself. So there was blood and violence in Gilead. Next, we have the first mention of this idea of the people as robbers and thieves. Now, it seems unlikely that the priests were actually taking up swords and raiding people and attacking people on the road. Seems unlikely. Possible, perhaps. But more likely, it seems that the text is trying to say that they were acting like robbers with how they dealt with the people. They were teaching the people to sin. They were stealing the animals for false sacrifices. They were encouraging hate and violence against one another. They were stealing the promises of God for the people and leading them to their own destruction. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd rather encounter a normal thief than deal with that. Now, I hope you haven't experienced this, but I'm sure many of you have. This reminds me of a specific situation. It's like putting some delicious leftovers in the fridge with your name on it. And you're excited about it, and you're excited to have it kind of the next day. Maybe you got some Hellberg, and you're going to have that for lunch tomorrow, and that's top 50 barbecue in Texas greatness. Or maybe you have the last big slice of your favorite pizza, and you can't wait to have it for breakfast the next morning. And yes, breakfast, cold pizza is a breakfast food. I will stand on that hill. But you put it in there, and you come back, and then you open the fridge, and you know immediately something is off. Right? It's in a different shelf. It's kind of turned differently, and you start getting worried. You open it up, and it's empty. Or maybe even worse, there's a huge bite taken out of it. What kind of monster just takes a bite out of it and puts it back? Terrible. Now, I joke, of course, and this is a disappointing experience. But imagine you come to the fridge, and it's not your lunch that's stolen, but it's your life. Where there should be security and help and comfort, there is now danger and destruction and hopelessness. The real principle here is not just the sin. It is that we make light of the sin, and in so doing reject God. We minimize the evil that we do. We don't see the gravity of our evil actions. We think they don't matter. We think they are of little importance. But as it says in verse 2, chapter 7, verse 2, God remembers them. Now you might be thinking, I'm not a thief, I'm not a murderer. And I hope so, certainly. But I know you definitely make little of the sin in your life. Because I do. I justify the sin in my life. I rationalize it. I say, I only did it because of what this person said. I only did it because I was in this situation or because I was forced to. We try so hard to make little of the sin in our lives, to blame everything else but ourselves. But God still remembers. The third picture, like a blazing oven, starting in verse 3. As we move now to this picture, we see more ways that the people reject God, and we start to see the sorry state of their political court in Israel, the rulers and the kings, where they stand. Verse 3. By their evil they make the king glad, and the princes by their treachery. They are all adulterers. They are like a heated oven whose baker ceases to stir the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. On the day of our king, the princes come sick with the heat of wine. He stretches out his hand with mockers. For with hearts like an oven they approach their intrigue. All night their anger smolders. In the morning it blazes like a flaming fire. All of them are hot as an oven, and they devour their rulers. All their kings have fallen, and none of them calls upon me. So there's two ideas happening here. In verse 3, we see that the king and the princes seem to be no better than the priests and the people, as the evil of the land brings them joy. A sorry state. Their violence and their debauchery and their anger are so great that they resemble a blazing oven. Now, baking ovens at this time would be kind of like round structures made of clay, often with a hole at the top for kind of the smoke to go through, and then one in the side to kind of put the fire in and whatever needs to be baked. And what you would do is you would kind of start a fire, a really, really hot fire in the middle of the oven. And you would let it burn really hot. And it would heat up the whole oven, right? So the whole thing is just blazing hot. And eventually you'd let the fire die down to just coals. And then you would kind of stick the bread in around the coals, or even you could kind of stick it like flatbreads against the oven itself. And that's how they cook their bread. And what we see in this passage is that these adulterer leaders are one of these ovens, but an oven so blazing hot that the baker doesn't even need to touch it. Normally, the baker would have to stir the fire to kind of keep it going, to get it hot, but here it is too hot. It is so hot it burns for hours, for the hours it takes for the dough to rise. So hot, in fact, that it smolders all night and is still burning. It's like when you go camping and it starts getting dark, so you build a fire, and as long as you want the fire to stay lit, you have to tend it. You have to keep adding more wood to make sure it keeps burning. You have to make sure it doesn't collapse on itself. It has enough air and all that sorts of stuff. And finally, when you decide to go to bed, you let it burn out. And when you wake up in the morning, of course, it's out. It's cold. And so you have to restart the fire. But the image here is that you left the fire alone when you went to bed, and you get up in the morning, and it's still blazingly hot. Not only did it not go out, but it just keeps burning and getting hotter and hotter. And that is a scary thing. That is a fire that is no longer useful. That is a fire that just burns all the bread, burns down the oven, and burns down the forest. And that is what has happened to the kings and the rulers of Israel. Their anger and their greed for power burned everything in its path and would not be stopped. As mentioned before, there was this series of kingly assassinations during this time in Israel. Zechariah, Shallum, Pekahiah, and Pekah, all these kings murdered the one before to gain power, and then was in turn murdered himself. Like an uncontrollable fire, their sins fed more sin, which feeds more sin. Verse 7 says it clearly. All of them are hot as an oven, and they devour their rulers. All their kings have fallen, and none of them calls upon me. So what's the principle here? Namely that we reject God through repeatedly falling into sin. When we keep giving way to sin and do not return to the Lord, the fire of sin burns stronger and stronger in our hearts until it consumes us. And so we must look at ourselves and see those patterns of sin in our life and give them to Jesus. Turning away from God is what gets them into these situations in the first place. So we have to turn back to Him and let Him and His wisdom help us make different decisions. Help us go a different way. The rulers here were spending their time drunk and with mockers, with the wrong people. And so maybe we need to make a change too, and not hang out with those people. Maybe we need to change jobs, move across town. Maybe we need to finally get some counseling, get some help. And certainly we need to confess our sin to the Lord and commit to regular times of prayer and devotion and Bible reading and service and seek after Him. Fourth picture, like a senseless dove, beginning in verse 8. In this section, we have moved from the shambles of the royal court to the mess of Israel's international relationships. There are several pictures here that are used to describe this terrible foreign policy that they have. The senseless dove being kind of the most prominent. In verse 8, we see the problem. Ephraim mixes himself with the peoples. In order to describe that truth, we get kind of three different pictures of this mixing himself with the people. First is that Ephraim is a cake not turned. Right? So continuing to stay in this kind of area of baking, this means that they are a loaf of bread that is completely burnt on one side and completely raw on the other. In other words, ruined. They have ruined themselves by mixing with the other nations. See, Israel, the point of the people of Israel that they were chosen. Right? They were specific. They were set apart by God to be examples to the nations. They were to be witnesses of God to the world. And by mixing with the other nations, they had ruined their purpose and their existence. Their example was no longer an example. They had gone from being set apart to being defiled. And the worst part is that they didn't even know what had happened. In verse 9, it says, "Gray hairs are sprinkled upon him, and he knows it not." Israel is like an old man with gray hair, but not just any old man, an old man who doesn't know he is old and is still trying to be youthful. He doesn't know he's past his prime. It's like that classic scene from the show 30 Rock where Steve Buscemi is playing kind of this terrible private investigator. And he goes undercover, and as like a 60-year-old man, he thinks he has successfully disguised himself as a teenager and a high school student. He like puts on a backwards cap and a hoodie and has a skateboard over one shoulder. And he goes up to a group of high school students and says, "How do you do, fellow kids?" And it's a funny picture because of just how absurd and how out of touch the character is. And that is Israel here. They have given up their youth and the best of themselves to others. And they are past their prime, trying to hold on to the glory days that were before them. And then we come to the picture that I think best describes Israel's foreign policy here. Verse 11 says, "Ephraim is like a dove, silly and without sense, calling to Egypt, going to Assyria. The people are like a senseless bird." Reminds me of kind of the dodo bird, if you've heard of this. It was this bird that is now extinct, and it's considered very dumb, a very dumb bird. And it was considered that because it would not run away from people who were trying to kill it. So if you killed a dodo bird and there was another one just right next to it, it would just stay there. It would not react. And so they considered it to be dumb. But here Israel is even worse. It's not only that they don't run away, they actually run toward the people trying to kill them. They mix with them. They waste their glory and strength and gifts on their enemies. And then they run back and forth between Assyria and Egypt and Assyria and Egypt, looking for help against the other. They are running after things that are killing them. They're running to anything they can, anything except the one thing that they need, their God. The principle here is that we reject God through our vain pursuit of worldly things. This is something I have seen in most of my life, both in myself and others. We constantly are running to things that can't help us, that can't fulfill us. We even run to the very thing that is causing us all the problems in the first place. Blaise Pascal, who's a famous mathematician, said this. He said, "What else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim, but there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object. In other words, by God himself. We must stop trying to fill the infinite hole in us with the things of this world. Running to this, running to that, like a senseless bird, we must fill it with God. And finally, the fifth picture, like a treacherous bow in verse 13. In this final section of our passage, we have a description of corrupted worship and its punishment, described by the picture of faithlessness and betrayal. In verse 14, it says, "They do not cry to me from their heart, but they wail upon their beds. For grain and wine, they gash themselves. They rebel against me." This is a reference to kind of the corrupt religious practices of the time. They had brought these kind of wailing and this cutting themselves that marks the worship of Baal into the worship of the true God. Now, you may remember the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. He kind of gathered all the people and the priests of Baal together on the mountain, and they were having kind of a competition. They set up 2 altars, one for the priests of Baal and one for the true God. And it went like this: if whichever God could send fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice on the altar would prove to be the real God of Israel. And so Elijah says, let's the priests of Baal go first. And they start out, and this is exactly what they do. They wail, and they scream, and they cry, and they cut themselves, and they do that for hours. And Elijah mockingly says, I guess your God's asleep, or he's relieving himself, or he can't hear you. Or, he makes fun of them. And then finally Elijah, it's his turn. And so he has them pour a bunch of water over the sacrifice, and he makes a simple prayer to the Lord, and immediately fire falls from the sky and consumes the sacrifice. So here we are in Hosea, a few hundred years after Elijah, that the worship of God has been tainted. Right? These practices of Baal have corrupted and come into the practices of the true God. And so the Lord says he does not hear their worship. He does not hear their cries because it is corrupted. In truth, they are rebelling against him in these practices. In the next 2 verses, we see kind of a military theme and punishment coming to the people. It says in verse 15, although I trained and strengthened their arms, yet they devised evil against me. They return, but not upward. They are like a treacherous bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword because of the insolence of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. The treacherous or faulty or deceitful bow refers to something that is faithless and unreliable, something that promises power and victory but delivers death and ruin. It's like a soldier who has his trusty gun, and that gun just jams at always the worst moment. It betrays him to his death, and that is Israel. Psalm 75, verses 56 and 57 says, yet they tested and rebelled against the Most High God and did not keep his testimonies, but turned back and acted treacherously like their fathers. They turned aside like a treacherous bow. And we see that this faithlessness, this treachery, will lead to their destruction. As their hearts and their leaders and their people and everything they have will be destroyed in war, and they will be the mockery of the nations. Now, all these pictures are helpful, convicting, but helpful at getting us to understand the weight of the problem. We can see the ways in which we reject God. But I want us to see something else that is found throughout this passage. And I've chosen the word reject very specifically here because that is what the people do. It's not a simple turning away from God. It is a continual rejection of the advances of God to bring them back. God is continually reaching out to them. Chapter 6, verse 5 says, therefore I have hewn them by the prophets, I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth. Chapter 6, verse 11, and chapter 7, verse 1 says, when I restore the fortunes of my people, when I would heal Israel, the iniquity of Ephraim is revealed. Chapter 7, verse 13, I would redeem them, but they speak lies against me. Chapter 7, verse 15, though I trained and strengthened their arms, yet they devise evil against me. Despite all of the evil they have done, over and over and over, God is seeking to heal them and redeem them and discipline them and bring them back to himself. God has not given up on them, and he doesn't give up on you. In every way possible, he was reaching out until finally he sends his son to them and to us. Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, sent by God. The Son of God, the fullness of the Godhead, the ultimate expression of God's love for his people. We who have rejected God in every way possible, whether hypocrisy or ignorance, sinful behavior or faithlessness or foolishness, we've been sent Jesus Christ and given redemption in his blood, despite all of that. Now, I know this has been a difficult passage to work through. It can be hard to call out and see all the ways we reject God. And so I want to close today. I want to leave us with this truth. We are not too far gone for Christ to save. John Newton, who was a famous preacher and hymn writer, was speaking with a friend towards the end of his life, and he said this: "My memory is nearly gone, but I remember two things: that I am a great sinner, and that Christ is a great Savior." Let us all remember those two things.